I was 15 years old the afternoon the world I knew stopped existing. Not slowly, not with warning. All at once, the way a window shatters, one moment whole, the next moment gone, and nothing in between but the sound of breaking. It was March 14th, 1969. Chicago was still carrying the weight of the year before. You could feel it in the city, the way you feel a bruise you stopped pressing on, but haven't forgotten. Martin Luther King had been gone for almost a year. Robert Kennedy, too. The summer of '68 had torn something open in this country that nobody quite knew how to close, and in the neighborhoods of the South Side, where my father and I lived, that open wound had a particular kind of silence around it, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. My father's name was Arthur Calloway. He was 43 years old, and he was the most precise man I have ever known. Not cold, precise. There is a difference. Cold people build walls. Precise people build foundations. My father built foundations in everything he touched, in his work, in his routines, in the way he raised me after my mother passed when I was 7 years old. He pressed his shirts the night before. He arrived at the office 20 minutes early every single day. He kept his pencils sharp and his files in order, and his word as solid as anything you could put your hand on. He was the Assistant Chief Financial Officer of Hargrove Federal Construction, one of the largest contracting firms in Illinois, with government contracts that stretched from public housing developments on the West Side all the way to federally funded infrastructure projects tied to the Great Society program. Lyndon Johnson's vision of building a better America from the ground up, brick by brick, neighborhood by neighborhood. My father believed in that vision. He talked about it at the dinner table the way other men talked about baseball. He would say, "Grace, do you understand what it means for a family to have a safe place to live? Not a building, a place. That is what these contracts are supposed to build." He said, supposed to, with a weight that I was too young to fully understand. Not yet. I was his little auditor. That was what he called me. From the time I was 9 or 10, I would sit beside him at the kitchen table in our apartment on Wentworth Avenue while he worked through ledgers and reports he'd brought home in his briefcase. He didn't explain things simply because he thought I couldn't understand. He explained things fully because he believed I could. He would point to a column of numbers and say, "Grace, what do you see here?" And I would look, and I would think, and I would answer. Sometimes wrong, mostly right, always listened to. He taught me that numbers were not just math, they were language. Every figure in a ledger was a sentence telling you something about where money came from and where it went. And like any language, numbers could be used to tell the truth or to construct a lie. The difference, he said, was in the details that didn't match, in the entry that was dated 3 days after it should have been, in the expenditure that referenced a project that had no corresponding physical progress, in the supplier whose invoices appeared regularly, but whose work was nowhere to be found. "Numbers don't lie," he would tell me, setting his pencil down and looking at me over the rim of his reading glasses. "People do." I have never forgotten that, not once in my life. Once in the months leading up to March of '69, something changed in my father. It came gradually enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying close attention. He started coming home later. Not much, but enough. Some evenings he would sit at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him and not write anything. Just sit with his hand resting on the open page and his eyes somewhere far away. He started carrying a second notebook alongside his regular work ledger. A smaller one, thinner, with a plain brown cover. He never explained what it was for, but I noticed that he wrote in it only when he thought I wasn't looking. 2 weeks before everything happened, he called me into the kitchen after dinner and sat me down across from him at the table. He put both hands flat on the surface the way he did when something needed to be said clearly and without interruption. He told me that there were people in this world who used their positions of power to take what was not theirs, who built their comfort on the backs of people who would never know their names, who, when they felt threatened, did not hesitate to destroy someone else to protect themselves. He said this calmly, without drama, the way he said everything. Then he looked at me for a long moment and said, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I have never taken a single dollar that wasn't mine. I have never signed a document I didn't believe to be true, and I have never stopped doing my job exactly as it should be done. I asked him what he meant by whatever happens. He said he meant nothing specific, that it was just a thing a father says to make sure his daughter knows who he is. But he held my eyes a beat too long when he said it. And that night, after I had gone to bed, I heard him moving quietly in his room for a long time, before the light under his door finally went out. 5 days later, he left for work in the morning, the way he always did. Brown suit pressed the night before, briefcase in his right hand. The small brown notebook tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket. He kissed the top of my head at the door and said, "Study hard today, little auditor." I said I would. He did not come home. They came to the apartment at 4 in the afternoon. 2 officers, one in uniform and one in plain clothes, with a warrant for the arrest of Arthur James Calloway on charges of federal embezzlement and fraudulent misrepresentation in connection with contracts issued under the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The man in plain clothes read the charges from a paper with the flat efficiency of someone who has done this hundreds of times. The man in uniform looked somewhere past my left shoulder the entire time. I stood in the doorway and I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt something happen inside my chest that I don't have a precise word for even now, a kind of compression, as though all the air in the room had been replaced with something heavier. I stood very still and I listened and I committed everything to memory, the way my father had taught me to do with numbers. Every detail, every word, every name on the warrant that I could read before the man in plain clothes folded it back into his jacket. Richard Hargrove. The name of the company owner appeared once in the document as the complainant, the man who had signed the complaint against my father, the man who had handed his own CFO's right hand to the authorities with a paper trail already prepared. After they left, I went to my father's room. I knew what I was looking for without having to think about it. He had told me once, without telling me directly, exactly where he kept things that mattered. I found the brown notebook in the drawer of his nightstand, beneath a folded photograph of my mother. I found a sealed envelope in the back of his closet behind his winter coat, with my name written on the front in his careful handwriting. I found a folder of documents that I didn't fully understand yet, but recognized as significant by the way they were organized, cross-referenced, annotated, flagged at specific pages with small paper clips. I put all of it into my school backpack. On top I placed the photograph of my mother, a change of clothes and my own schoolbooks. A woman from the Department of Children and Family Services arrived at 6:30. She was not unkind. She explained in a careful voice that I would be placed at the Northside Group home on North Clark Street while my father's case was processed. She said, "Processed the way people say words they've been trained to use because the real words are too heavy for the situation." She said, I was allowed to bring personal belongings. She did not specify how many. I brought the backpack. I left everything else. The building on North Clark Street was a narrow 3-story structure, squeezed between a laundromat and a hardware store, with a painted sign above the door that had once been dark green and had faded to a color that had no name. Inside it smelled like industrial floor cleaner and overcooked vegetables. The hallways were lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed faintly at a frequency that you stopped hearing after a few days, but never fully stopped feeling. The director was a man named Mr. Kowalski. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavy-set with short grey hair and the air of someone who had made peace with the gap between what things were supposed to be and what they actually were. He showed me to my room on the 2nd floor, a narrow space with 2 beds, 2 small dressers, and a window that looked out onto the brick wall of the building next door. He told me the rules in a voice that was neither friendly nor unfriendly. Lights out at 9:30. Breakfast at 7, school attendance mandatory, visitors on Friday afternoons between 2 and 5, no exceptions. He did not ask me how I was. My roommate was a girl named Pauline, 13 years old, who had been there for 7 months and who assessed me with the rapid efficiency of someone who has learned to take quick inventory of new arrivals. She decided within approximately 4 minutes that I was quiet enough to be tolerable and went back to reading her comic book. I sat on my bed with the backpack on my lap and did not unpack it. I waited until the lights went out and Pauline's breathing evened into sleep. Then I reached under my pillow, where I had placed the brown notebook, and I turned on the small flashlight I kept in the front pocket of the backpack, and I opened to the first page. My father's handwriting looked back at me in the pale beam of the flashlight. Columns of figures, project codes, dates, supplier names, reference numbers that corresponded to federal contract documents I had seen on his desk at home. And throughout it all, woven into the margins with a consistency that I began to recognize after the first dozen pages, the same two initials appearing again and again beside certain entries, R.H. Richard Hargrove. I did not sleep that night. I read until the beam of the flashlight began to dim, and the first grey light of morning appeared around the edge of the curtain. Then I closed the notebook, put it back under my pillow, and lay in the dark with the numbers arranged in my mind like pieces of a structure whose shape I was just beginning to see. My father had not stolen anything. He had been documenting someone else's theft. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that was nothing like the life I had known on Wentworth Avenue, but that became, by necessity, the shape of my days. School in the mornings, where I sat in the back row and answered questions correctly and attracted the minimum possible attention. Meals in the group home's dining room, where the food was adequate and the noise was considerable, and I learned which tables to avoid. Evenings in the narrow room with Pauline, who turned out to be quietly funny in a dry way that I grew to appreciate, and who asked me no questions about why I was there, which I appreciated even more. And every night, after the lights went out, the flashlight, and the notebook, I was working through the entries systematically, the way my father had taught me to approach any set of numbers, not from the most dramatic entry to the least, from the beginning, in order, building understanding the way you build anything solid, one layer at a time. I had been there for about 6 weeks when I found the first thing that shifted my understanding from suspicion to something closer to certainty. In the notebook's entries from early 1968, there was a sequence of payments to a supplier called Midwest Building Materials, LLC. The payments were substantial, each one listed against a specific federal housing project on the west side, charged as expenditure for structural materials. The amounts were credible. The documentation codes were properly formatted. On the surface, nothing alarming. But I remembered something my father had said at the dinner table once, months before any of this began, talking about the housing projects. He had said, "Grace, you know what I learned today? That the best place to hide a number that shouldn't exist is inside a number that's supposed to." And he had smiled his small, precise smile, the one that meant he was working something out, and the working out was satisfying even before the answer arrived. I had not understood that fully when he said it. I understood it now. Midwest Building Materials, LLC appeared in the federal contract documentation as a registered supplier, but the payments in the notebook were dated and coded against a specific project, the Harrison Street housing development, and when I cross-referenced those dates and amounts against the separate folder of documents I had taken from my father's closet, I found something that made me set the flashlight down on the mattress and press my hands flat against the page to keep them steady. The Harrison Street development had been officially paused due to funding reallocation in September of 1967, months before the payments to Midwest Building Materials began appearing in the notebook. My father had been billing material expenditures against a project that officially did not exist anymore, or rather, someone had been billing those expenditures, and the someone who controlled those billing authorizations was not my father. It was Richard Hargrove. I lay in the dark for a long time after that, listening to Pauline breathe and to the distant sound of a bus on North Clark Street and to the fluorescent hum that was always there beneath everything else. I thought about my father sitting at our kitchen table on Wentworth Avenue with his hand flat on the open ledger and his eyes somewhere far away. I thought about the 2 weeks of careful, measured conversations that had felt, looking back, like a man settling his affairs. He had known. He had spent months building the documentation, and he had hidden it in a place where only I would know to look, and in a language that only I had been taught to read. I reached under my pillow and took out the sealed envelope with my name on the front. I had been carrying it for 6 weeks without opening it. I had known somehow that I needed to understand more of the notebook before I read the letter. that the letter would mean more once I had done the work. I opened it carefully, the way you open something that has been waiting the right amount of time. My father's handwriting filled the single page inside. He wrote without drama, the way he did everything. Grace, if you are reading this, then what I was afraid might happen has happened. I need you to know something before anything else. I have been doing my job, exactly as it should be done. The entries in the brown notebook are not evidence of what I took. They are evidence of what I found. I have spent the better part of a year documenting irregularities in the Hargrove federal accounts that point to a sustained pattern of fraudulent billing against federal housing contracts. The money did not go to build homes for families who needed them. It went elsewhere. I was close to having everything I needed to go to the right authorities. Apparently, I was not fast enough. If you are reading this, it means Richard Hargrove moved before I could. I'm not asking you to fix this. I am not asking you to carry something no 15-year-old should have to carry. But I am telling you the truth, because you have always deserved the truth. And because I know you, my little auditor. I know you have been reading the notebook. I know because I built it for you as much as for anyone, in the language we made together at the kitchen table on Wentworth Avenue. Numbers don't lie, Grace, and neither does your father. All my love, Arthur. The fluorescent hum was still there. The bus had passed. Pauline was still breathing in the steady rhythm of sleep. I folded the letter back into the envelope, with both hands perfectly steady. Then I placed it in the back of the notebook, turned the flashlight back on and opened to the next page. There was more work to do. It was a Friday afternoon in the middle of April, when Diana Wells walked into the Northside group home for the first time since I had arrived. I would learn later that she came every second Friday of the month, as she had been doing for almost 2 years, providing free legal guidance to residents and their families through the Southside Legal Civil Rights Cooperative, the small non-profit law office, where she worked on cases that the system preferred not to look at too closely. I was sitting in the narrow hallway outside the common room with the brown notebook in my lap and the folder of documents open beside me on the floor, working through a cross-reference that I had been piecing together for 3 days, and that was finally beginning to resolve into something coherent. I did not look up when I heard footsteps coming down the hall. Then the footsteps stopped. I looked up. She was standing about 6 feet away, looking at what was in my lap. She was somewhere in her early 30s, with natural hair worn in a full rounded shape that in 1969 carried its own quiet statement, and dark eyes that had the particular quality of sharpness that comes from years of learning to see what other people miss. She wore a charcoal grey jacket over a white blouse, and she carried a briefcase in one hand and a notepad in the other, and she was looking at the document in my lap with an expression I could not immediately read. Then she looked at me. "What is that?" she said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. I looked down at the document and then back at her and said, "It is a cross-reference between billing records from a federal housing contract and the official project status documentation from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it shows that a contractor has been submitting expenditure claims against a project that was officially suspended 18 months before the claims were made." She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "How old are you?" 15. Another second of quiet. Then she sat down on the floor of the hallway, cross-legged, set her briefcase beside her and said, "Tell me everything." Her name was Diana Wells. She had grown up on the South Side, gone to law school at Howard University in Washington, and come back to Chicago because she believed the South Side was where the work was. The real work. The work that didn't get written up in the papers and didn't make careers in large firms and didn't come with easy victories, but that mattered in the specific, granular, irreplaceable way that a family staying in their home instead of being put out on the street matters. She had been fighting that kind of fight for 7 years, and she was, as she told me once later with no particular bitterness, very accustomed to fighting uphill. When I finished telling her about my father, about the notebook, about Hargrove and the Harrison Street development, and the pattern of fraudulent billing I had documented across 6 weeks of careful nighttime reading, she did not say anything for a while. She looked at the notebook in my hands, and then she looked at me, and I could see her assembling what I had told her into something she could work with, the way I had watched my father assemble a set of figures into a structure that meant something. Then she said, "Grace, what you're describing isn't just a state-level fraud case. If the billing irregularities are against federally funded HUD contracts, this is federal jurisdiction. That means the FBI, not the Chicago PD. And it means the stakes are considerably higher for Hargrove and for whoever helped him construct the paperwork to put your father in that cell." I said I understood. She looked at me for a moment as if assessing whether I actually did. Then she nodded once, opened her notepad and said, "I'm going to need to see everything in that notebook." I held it out to her. She took it with both hands, the way you take something that has weight beyond its physical size, and opened to the first page. And in the narrow hallway of the North Side Group home on North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, on a Friday afternoon in April of 1969, with the fluorescent lights humming above us and the distant sound of the city outside, we began. The work we did in the months that followed was not the kind of work that looks dramatic from the outside. There were no courtrooms yet, no confrontations, no moments of sudden revelation in front of witnesses. It was quieter than that, and harder than that, and more painstaking than almost anything I had done in my 15 years of living. It was the work of building something solid enough to stand against the weight of a man who had money, connections, and an entire year's head start on destroying my father's reputation. Diana came every second Friday without fail. She would arrive at 2 o'clock, sign in with Mr. Kowalski at the front desk, and walk down the hall to wherever I was sitting. We had migrated from the floor of the hallway to a small, unused room on the ground floor that Mr. Kowalski allowed us to use after Diana explained to him, with a precise and unhurried courtesy that I came to recognize as one of her most effective tools, that she was providing legal assistance in connection with a pending federal matter. He did not ask follow-up questions. He gave us the room. It had a folding table and 2 metal chairs and a window that looked out on the alley between the building and the laundromat next door. Not much light. Enough. Diana had been doing her own work in the 2 weeks between each visit. She had colleagues at the cooperative who specialized in federal contract law and in housing rights litigation, and she had begun, carefully and quietly, pulling every publicly available document related to the Hargrove federal construction contracts under the Great Society program, federal procurement records, project status reports filed with HUD, Inspector General correspondence, budget amendments, the kind of documents that existed in filing cabinets in government offices and that most people would never think to request, and that Diana had been requesting 1 letter at a time, with the patience of someone who understood that the paper trail was the whole case. What she was finding corroborated what I had found in the notebook, and then went further. The Harrison Street development was not the only suspended project against which Hargrove had continued billing. There were 2 others, a community health clinic on the west side, funding paused in early 1968, a school expansion project in Woodlawn, officially halted pending environmental review in late 1967. In all 3 cases, the public records showed the projects dormant, and in all 3 cases, the notebook entries my father had compiled showed continued expenditure claims submitted and approved through Hargrove's billing department, the department whose authorizations required the signature of the Assistant CFO. My father's signature, forged. Diana spread the documents across the folding table one Friday afternoon and let me look at them for a while before she said anything. Then she said, "This is what forgery in a federal contracting context looks like, Grace. Your father's signature appears on authorization documents for expenditures he had no knowledge of, on projects he was never told had been suspended, processed through an internal billing system that he had no direct daily access to because that access was held by Hargrove's personal financial administrator." I asked her who the financial administrator was. She placed one finger on a name at the bottom of a procurement authorization form. A man named Gerald Fitch. Hargrove's right hand in the financial office. The man who had, according to 3 separate documents that Diana had pulled through Freedom of Information requests, personally processed every fraudulent billing authorization in the 18 months before my father's arrest. My father had not just discovered the fraud. He had been building a file on Gerald Fitch. I knew this because of something I had found in the notebook in the 7th week of reading it, when I had finally worked my way through to the later entries. On a page dated January of '69, barely 2 months before the arrest, my father had written in the margin beside a particularly complex set of cross-references, in handwriting slightly smaller than usual, as if compressed by urgency, a single line that I had read 15 times trying to understand its full implication. GF controls the submission window. Hargrove never touches the paper directly. Gerald Fitch was the mechanism. Hargrove was the architect. And between the two of them they had constructed a system that was designed to be invisible from the outside, and if it ever came apart, to leave someone else holding the pieces. That someone had been my father. When I showed Diana that margin note, she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I heard 2 buses pass on North Clark Street outside. Then she said, "Your father understood exactly what he was looking at, and he was documenting it precisely enough that we can follow his reasoning." That is extraordinary, Grace. Most people who discover something like this either go to the authorities too soon with insufficient evidence or wait too long and lose the window. Your father was threading a needle. I said he was always very precise. She looked at me with something in her eyes that I recognized because I had seen it in my father's eyes too, the particular look of someone encountering a mind working correctly, and she said, "So are you. We kept building." By June, we had assembled what Diana called a preliminary evidentiary structure, the notebook as the spine, the forged authorization documents as the frame, the public project status records as external corroboration, and a pattern of fraudulent billing across 3 federal contracts totaling, by my careful calculation, over several nights with the flashlight and the folder of documents, somewhere in the range of $400,000 diverted over 18 months. In federal contract terms, in Great Society program terms, in terms of homes that were never built for families who needed them, $400,000. Diana said that number quietly when I told her, and then said it again, and then sat still for a moment with her pen resting motionless against the notepad. Then she said, "We need a corroborating witness." I already knew that. I had been thinking about it for weeks. The documents were powerful. But documents required interpretation. A witness, someone who had seen something directly, who could place themselves inside the mechanism and describe it from the inside, was what transformed a paper argument into something a federal prosecutor could stand behind. Diana had been thinking about the same problem, and she had found a thread worth pulling. In the public procurement records, there was a pattern she had noticed involving a small material supplier on the northwest side called Lake Shore Supply. The company had received payments from Hargrove Federal Construction on all 3 of the fraudulently billed projects. Unlike Midwest Building Materials, which appeared to be a shell company created specifically for the scheme, Lake Shore Supply was a real business with a real address and a real owner. A man named Thomas Greer, who had been operating the business for 11 years and who had, as far as Diana could determine from the public record, no obvious connection to Hargrove personally, which meant he might not have known what his company's name was being used for. Diana went to see him on a Tuesday morning in late June. She told me about it the following Friday, in the room with the folding table. She said he had answered the door of his shop himself, a man in his early 50s with sawdust on his work pants, and the wary expression of a small business owner who has learned that unexpected visitors rarely bring good news. She told him who she was and why she was there. He let her in. He knew something was wrong, Diana said. He had known for a while. 2 of the payment deposits he received from Hargrove Federal had come with delivery addresses that he didn't recognize for materials he had no record of preparing or shipping. He had assumed clerical error and filed it away. But he had the records. Every delivery, every invoice, every address, 11 years in business and not a single paper out of place. One of those delivery addresses was a private warehouse registered to a holding company in Cicero, a holding company whose registered agent, when Diana's colleague ran it through the Illinois Secretary of State records, traced back to Gerald Fitch. The money had not disappeared. It had traveled. From the federal contracts through the fraudulent billings through the shell suppliers to a warehouse registered to Hargrove's financial administrator. The full circuit, documented, traceable, and now in the hands of Diana Wells. I am not a person given to celebrating before the work is done. My father taught me that. You don't close the books on a figure until every line balances. But when Diana spread those final documents on the folding table that Friday and walked me through the complete chain, I allowed myself, for exactly the length of one slow breath, to feel something close to certainty. Then a Monday came that changed the temperature of everything. Mr. Kowalski called me into his office in the morning before breakfast. He was sitting behind his desk, with the careful expression of a man delivering information he does not entirely understand, but has been asked to convey. He told me that a request had been submitted through the DCFS regional office for my transfer to a group home in Rockford. The documentation cited administrative capacity management as the reason. The transfer was proposed for the following week. Rockford was 90 miles away. I stood on the other side of his desk and kept my face composed by an act of will that I felt in every muscle. I asked Mr. Kowalski who had submitted the request. He said it had come through the regional office and that the originating party was listed as a legal representative, acting on behalf of an interested party in the Callaway case. He read the name of the law firm from the paper in front of him. It was a large firm on LaSalle Street, one of the most prominent commercial litigation firms in Chicago, Richard Hargrove's lawyers. I thanked Mr. Kowalski and walked out of his office and went directly to the phone in the hallway and asked the woman at the front desk if I could make a call. She looked at me for a moment and then said yes. Diana answered on the second ring. I told her in a single sentence what had happened. There was a pause of approximately 3 seconds. Then she said, "I will be there this afternoon." She arrived at 1:30. We did not go to the small room with the folding table. We stood in the hallway outside Mr. Kowalski's office, and Diana spoke to him for 12 minutes in a voice that was the most quietly controlled thing I have ever heard. She explained that the minor in question was a material participant in an active legal matter involving federal contract fraud, that any transfer of her placement would constitute interference with that proceeding, and that the law firm on LaSalle Street was representing a party against whom evidence was currently being compiled, making their involvement in a DCFS transfer request a conflict of interest that she would be filing a formal complaint about before the end of the business day. Mr. Kowalski looked at her over the rims of his glasses for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called the regional office. The transfer request was suspended by 4 o'clock that afternoon. But Diana and I both understood what the transfer request meant. Hargrove knew. Not just that my father had compiled evidence, not just that there was a notebook. He knew that the notebook was with me, that I was working with a lawyer, and that the case was moving. The transfer to Rockford was not administrative efficiency. It was an attempt to remove the center of gravity from the case before it reached the point of no return, which meant we were closer than he was comfortable with. Diana filed the formal conflict of interest complaint as promised. She also did something that I had not expected. She called a colleague, a man named Robert Haynes, who worked in the Federal Public Integrity Unit of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. And she told him that she had a material witness, documentary evidence, and a corroborating witness in a case involving fraudulent billing against HUD-funded federal contracts under the Great Society program. Robert Haynes asked her how solid the evidence was. She said solid enough that someone just tried to move the witness 90 miles away. He asked her to come in the following week. What happened in the 2 months after that meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office is not mine to describe in full detail because most of it happened in rooms I was not in conversations between lawyers and federal investigators that I was too young to be present for. What I know is what Diana told me on the Fridays when she came, and what I pieced together later when I was old enough to read the full case record. Robert Haynes opened a federal investigation into Hargrove Federal Construction. Investigators subpoenaed the company's internal records. They found, consistent with everything my father's notebook had predicted, a systematic pattern of fraudulent billing. They found Gerald Fitch's warehouse in Cicero. They found the holding company. They found the financial trail that my father had spent a year documenting and that Diana and I had spent months corroborating. And they found, in the company's own internal files, a memorandum written by Richard Hargrove to his personal attorney 11 days before my father's arrest, discussing the risk posed by a certain employee who had become too thorough in his review of contract expenditures and needed to be dealt with decisively. That memorandum was the thing that changed everything from a financial fraud case to something larger. It showed premeditation. It showed that my father had not been incidentally caught in a legal trap, but had been deliberately placed in one by a man who understood exactly what he was doing. In November of 1970, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Richard Hargrove on 12 counts of federal contract fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and obstruction of justice. Gerald Fitch was indicted separately and entered into a cooperation agreement. The law firm on LaSalle Street that had attempted to file the transfer request for my relocation was named in the obstruction charge. In April of 1971, 2 years and 1 month after they had come to the apartment on Wentworth Avenue, with a warrant and a flat voice reading charges, the federal court vacated the conviction of Arthur James Calloway on all counts. The documentation showed that the evidence used to indict him had been fabricated using forged authorizations he had never signed and billing records he had never approved. Diana came to the group home on a Friday morning, not her usual Friday, a different one, and she found me in the hallway in the same spot where she had first found me almost 2 years before. She stood in front of me, and for a moment she did not say anything. Her eyes were bright in a way I had not seen before. Then she said, "Grace, your father is coming home. Your father is..." I had been precise and controlled and composed for 2 years and 1 month. I had held the notebook and the letter and the work and the grief and the waiting inside a structure that I had built deliberately, the way my father built foundations, solid enough to stand under any weight. Something let go when she said those words. Not everything, but enough. I let it. The morning they released Arthur Calloway from the federal detention facility on the north side was a Thursday in late April, with a sky the pale, clear blue that Chicago gets sometimes in spring, when the wind comes in off the lake and washes everything clean. Diana drove us there in her car, the 3 of us arriving at the facility parking lot at 7:45 in the morning, me in the back seat, with the backpack on my lap and the brown notebook inside it. I had carried that notebook every single day for 2 years and 1 month. I had not left it in the room on North Clark Street for a single night. It had been under my pillow and in my backpack and on my lap in that small room with the folding table, and it had been the constant physical weight of everything that was at stake and everything that was true, and I was not going to put it down until I could hand it back to the person it belonged to. When the facility doors opened and my father walked out into the pale blue morning, he was thinner. There were more lines at the corners of his eyes and more grey in his hair at the temples than I remembered. He was wearing the brown suit he had worn the day they took him, the one that had been returned to him with his personal effects, and it hung slightly differently on him now, the way clothes do when the person inside them has changed. He looked across the parking lot and he found me immediately. The way he always had in any room, in any crowd, the way I had come to understand was particular to the love between a parent and a child, that specific and immediate recognition that does not require searching. I crossed the parking lot. He came toward me. When we reached each other, he put both arms around me and held on in a way that was different from any embrace I had known before, not the careful, measured affection of a precise man, but something underneath all the precision, the part that precision was always protecting, the part that had been waiting 2 years and 1 month to be allowed out. I pressed my face against his chest, and I felt his chin come to rest on top of my head, and I felt the breath go through him in a long, slow release. After a while he said, in a voice rougher than I remembered, "Little auditor." I said, "The numbers didn't lie, Dad." He held on a little tighter. Diana was standing a few yards back, giving us the distance the moment needed. When my father finally stepped back and looked at her, he extended his hand, and she took it. He said, "Thank you." She said what she had said to me once, in this version of it directed at him, "Don't thank me. Your daughter did the work." He looked at me. I showed him the backpack. He understood without my saying anything. He put one hand on the back of my head for a moment, the way he used to do when I was small, and then he straightened up and took a breath of the cool April air and looked at the pale blue sky above the facility and didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't need to. Richard Hargrove was convicted on 9 of the 12 federal counts and sentenced to 14 years. Gerald Fitch served 4 years under his cooperation agreement. The law firm that had filed the transfer request was censured by the Illinois Bar. The federal government, through HUD, later conducted an audit of all Hargrove federal contracts and recovered what could be recovered, though the homes that should have been built on the west side and in Woodlawn were never built, and the families who should have lived in them never did. And that loss is the part of the story that does not have a tidy resolution. My father returned to accounting, not to corporate work. He opened a small practice on the south side, doing books for small businesses and individuals, the kind of clients that the large firms didn't want and that needed honest numbers more than anyone. He rebuilt slowly and carefully, the way he did everything. I finished high school. I went to the University of Illinois on a scholarship, then to law school at Howard University in Washington, the same school where Diana had studied, because when I knew where I wanted to go, it was not despite that connection, but because of it. I came back to Chicago because that was where the work was. I joined Diana at the Southside Legal Civil Rights Cooperative 2 years after passing the bar. We shared an office for 11 years before she retired. The cases we took were the cases that other firms walked past, workers who had been made into scapegoats, employees who had discovered something they were not supposed to discover and been punished for it. People for whom the machinery of the law had been turned against them by people with more power and less principle. I took every one of those cases as if it were my father's case, because in the way that matters, it was. The brown notebook is on the wall of my office. Diana found a frame for it the year I made partner, a simple dark wood frame with glass, and she hung it herself on the wall behind my desk without telling me she was going to do it. I came in one morning, and there it was. I stood in the doorway for a long time looking at it. Below the frame there is a small brass plaque. I had it made myself. It says, "Numbers don't lie. People do." Every associate who comes into my office reads it and asks me where it comes from. I tell them. All of it. The kitchen table on Wentworth Avenue and the flashlight under the blanket, and the folding table in the room on North Clark Street, and the parking lot in April with the pale blue sky. Because the story is not just mine, it never was. It belongs to my father, who did his job exactly as it should be done and trusted that the truth was worth more than his safety. It belongs to Diana, who sat down on a hallway floor in a group home in 1969 and listened to a 15-year-old girl explain federal contract fraud and decided that was worth her Friday afternoons for the next 2 years. It belongs to Thomas Greer, who kept his records in order for 11 years out of basic professional integrity and never knew that one day those records would be the link that closed the chain. It belongs to Robert Haynes, who picked up the phone when Diana called and understood what she was telling him. And it belongs to every person who has ever carried a truth that was heavy enough to crush them and chose to keep carrying it anyway, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The truth does not need to be fast. It does not need to be loud. It needs only to be documented, preserved, handed carefully from the person who found it to the person who can use it, across whatever distance and whatever time that passage requires. It will get where it needs to go. It always does. This story of Grace and Arthur Calloway reminds us that the most powerful thing a parent can give a child is not protection from the world, but preparation for it. The belief, built carefully over years, that the child is capable of carrying what needs to be carried, and sometimes that belief is the only thing standing between injustice and the light. If this story moved you, share it with someone who is in the middle of fighting something they didn't start and aren't sure they can finish, and leave a comment below. I want to know, if you had been Grace, 15 years old, alone in that group home with your father's notebook, would you have had the courage to open it? Tell me your answer. I read every single one.